The 5th generation of Armored Core games was the final one series overseer Toshifume Nabeshima worked on. I feel he basically knocked it out of the park with the 3rd game and the 4th gen, so at this point he might have coasted and decided to just do some victory laps. The formula had been overhauled from the old generations already, so why not just reappropriate the 4th gen style and make that the new baseline experience? But no. Stylistically, Armored Core 5 is probably the biggest departure from the Armored Core style in the entire lineup, and it's bordering on the edge of genius and insanity. On one hand, it has hands down the best tactical gameplay, but on the other hand, this is the one where Nabeshima unveiled the Densetsu no Eisi Mochi, or the legendary Armored Core grip. If this is your first introduction to my Armored Core Retrospective series, I'd recommend you pause this video and watch them in chronological order before proceeding, because I'll be building on top of a lot of ideas I've discussed already. And I'll be taking it as a given that we're on the same wavelength when it comes to how I digest these games. I'm AesirAesthetics, grab yourself a cup of coffee, and let's dive in. Our man, Nabeshima, has described the work he did on the franchise prior to this game as upgrading what they did in the first entry. And if you play through the series, you can see how this sentiment applies all the way up to the 4th gen games, which was when everything became faster and a very specific conceptualization of the license became realized. It's a testament to the foundation laid down in the first game that the series maintained steam for as long as it did, but from the offset of this game's development, Nabeshima wanted it to be different. Armored Core 5 is arguably more interesting as an Armored Core game than it is as a standalone title. It has so many weird things going on that I can't see myself wholeheartedly recommending the game to the average gamer, but if you're interested in the Armored Core identity and the evolution of this series, this might be the most interesting one to dive into. It's a lot more in keeping with the clunky dystopian mood of the original games than it is the overhauled format we got in the 4th gen games, the one where Miyazaki quote-unquote ruined Armored Core. I don't personally prescribe to that sentiment, and I'd argue that even though the mood in the 5th gen games is closer to what the original games had going for themselves, the 4th gen titles are a lot more faithful to the Armored Core style than the 5th gen titles are. One can argue that Armored Core 3 was the perfect distillation of everything old school Armored Core could be, and if you wanted to, you can also argue that Armored Core 4 was the logical endpoint of where the series was headed and how far that kind of game could go. Some players were upset at the changes made during the 4th generation, but honestly, I can see where the developers were coming from. Anything after the 3rd game which followed the exact same mold was necessarily going to be an iterative, since the formula was basically perfected at that point. But it was also going to be harder to get into than the older games because we'd entered the 7th console generation, and asking people to continue going back to that old style just wasn't going to happen. The 5th gen games are a lot more informed by the game design conventions of its era than the 4th gen games are, what with the more linear, tied-together story, abundance of cutscenes, and emphasized online play, but even these pulls from mainstream action games cannot explain why the 5th gen ACs feel so radically different to play. To explain that, we need to understand the significance Chrome Hounds had on Nabeshima. It's a 2006 mech game that he produced, and it focuses a lot more on strategy and online than any Armored Core had up until this point, complete with mech classes or role types. That game was beloved by a niche player base, but it didn't get a direct follow-up. But Nabeshima had a lot of concepts for a Chrome Hounds 2 which he wanted to develop, so Armored Core 5. Or actually, Armored Core V. Because this isn't another conventional sequel. This is a big stylistic change, and Nabeshima wanted the developers and the players to know as much. To complete the overhaul, the team also focused more on online play than they ever had before. In my videos on the 4th gen games, I reasoned that the changes those games made to the style all make sense if you accept that they were rebalancing the game after speeding everything up. Make Armored Core 3 faster, and you have to fiddle around with every component of the game until you basically get Armored Core 4. And in the same way, I think you can rationally get from Armored Core 4 to 5 if you think the formula was being rebalanced around the multiplayer. I won't be talking about the multiplayer aspect of the game much in this video because the servers were gone before I first played it, but the multiplayer was an integral part of the game during development, so we have to figure they made decisions with the best practices for it in mind. Armored Core 5 is a very strange title, because it was developed under very strange circumstances. I've given the context I figure made for the most impact on the game's development, and I think it does get it fully rationalizing what we ultimately got when the game released. But this is the first Armored Core to release after Demon's Souls, and I fully believe the online system designed for that game goes some ways to explain Armored Core 5. I couldn't find any document stating as much, and it's not like every other franchise under the sun wasn't being made to ship with some multiplayer mode in this era, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but 2012 saw FromSoftware in the middle of a very transformative era, and I don't think the success of Miyazaki's Souls series would have gone unnoticed by the other departments. And as you probably know, these games are very much informed by the environments they are developed in. The setting of the first game way back when was born from the technological limitations of the PlayStation 1. Nabeshima asked the programmers if the game they were planning on making was feasible, and they told him it would be if the entire thing was set underground. Basically, long draw distances would not work, and this is actually where the storyline of an underground civilization came about. The corporate war came about because they didn't feel like military lingo was working. The player being a mercenary was a development which happened when Nabeshima asked who is paying the player their rewards, and every question downstream of that one gradually got us to the series' corporate mercenary concept. Like it was with the gameplay, the story fundamentals they laid down in the first game have continued to be integral in subsequent entries. Armored Core 5's story takes place in a non-too-descript futuristic dystopia, and a lot of the recurring Armored Core tropes are being reused. Mankind lives under dictatorial rule in a safe hub away from the polluted planet. This time around, though, it's not underground. It's a North American city-state, and the dictatorial rule of Father is maintained with the mech police and a strict apartheid. And it's located south of a legendary contaminated zone. I made a whole video detailing my love of urban exploration, and without rehashing the whole thing here, the love comes from how urban environments allow for more obtuse and unnatural geometric shapes than any natural environment can, which means the level design is easier to mask than in any other biome, which means the limitations imposed on designers by the setting is not as excessive, which means the level designers are freer to go wild in this setting than any other. Other than like some alpha movement test maps. The other thing that makes me love urban environments is their connection to humanity. Every car on the street has an owner, every house was built by someone in the universe. Even if you just plop a shack down in the woods, you're implying humanity has had a presence in that area, and depending on the context the urban phenomenon is presented in, you can really squeeze a lot of storytelling from surprisingly little work. Human habitation can play with our sense of safety, our sense of belonging, or our sense of wanting to blow a lot of things up. Trees don't explode, after all. Oh, but buildings don't explode either. Yeah, one of the big changes to the gamification of the urban setting from the 4th gen to this game is that buildings are no longer destructible, so when navigating, you won't find yourself making your own path as much as you are being funneled through level design to reach your location objective. The 4th gen games allowed the player to overboost to wherever they wanted and to get really up and close with the enemies, but the 5th gen games don't really reward that sort of playstyle. You can build a mech which is better at that than other ones, but placement is so much more important here than before, and climbing to the top of buildings to get the high ground on a target, or retreating through alleyways when you're overrun happens more here than before. The combat has become more tactical, you might say, and the battlefield keeps changing in very impactful ways. the impact of every single piece of cover or climbable terrain or tunnel is so much more pronounced than ever before. When it comes to the gameplay, the best levels are the ones which utilize the visual cover given to them by the urban setting to make for some interesting layouts which you will want to navigate differently depending on your build. But when it comes to atmosphere, I gotta give it to the Wastelands. The environmental theming there is basically what I complained about for Answer not being, what with the environmental design of everything radiates toxicity. And something I quite like about the portrayal of the world in Armored Core 5 is that when we do get to take detours into the polluted wastelands, there are remains of human inhabitation there. The wastelands are generally very open spaces which exposes all combatants and empowers long-range fighters, but the dilapidated shacks and factories which are strewn around give the player some cover in case they want to use a different approach than the one dictated by the setting to be optimal. The contaminated zone is important to the game world's lore because it's where the dictatorship of Father began. He rules with advanced technology which he obtained years ago when he crossed deeper into the contaminated zone than anyone else ever had. The technology in the 5th gen AC titles is a return to form for the series after the animeification we saw in the 4th gen games. It's a reappropriation of the gritty militaristic cyberpunk mech design from the first game. Nabeshima explained in an interview that this contrast was a deliberate choice to have the 5th gen titles stand out and to express the altered world view of the games. He explained that the mechs in the 4th gen are fighter jets, but the ones in the 5th gen are tanks. The worldview change is not only felt in the altered visual aesthetic though, the sentiment is felt during missions as well, because after accepting a mission, we can, before it begins, actually swap out parts last minute on our mechs, and during missions we can call for resupply units which not only heal the mechs, stock up our ammo, but also allow us to swap parts around mid-mission. There's a much clearer sense in the 5th gen games than ever before in this series that the spreadsheet management aspect of mech warfare also extends to the battlefront. If war is a game, it is a game of logistics. The morality of the mech war here follows the series' tradition of not being easily solvable because the injustices committed by the parties have rationales which cannot easily be brushed aside. After Father established control over the city, he was faced with the problem of the available resources not having kept up with the human population number, which is why he instituted an apartheid system. He could not foresee a future if resources were stretched too thin, and because the place was on the brink of collapse, the poor were relocated to live underground. Armored Core often explores the idea of how conditions can shape the behaviors of mankind both on the micro and the macro scale. The 4th gen games' lore talked about a war where the governments of the world were destroyed by the corporations because mankind wanted a force above them that was willing to take drastic measures to solve the resource problem afflicting them. And of course, every game has made the player complicit in the horrors of the mech economy by offering no alternative. Armored Core is not so simple as to say power corrupts, because even when the people in this license are doing awful things, they are usually given rationales, or they have their insanity checked by the insanity of the world they live in. The actions of the humans who live in Armored Core are insane, but for how these people live in the Armored Core universes. When the baseline sanity of your universe is mech warfare and dwindling resources, it's not so obvious that anything less than brutality can ensure survival, and when the planet is dying and you have a lot of hungry mouths to feed, it's not obvious that there's any better solution than to prioritize some people over others. In that unfair scenario, at least some people get to live. I feel the franchise has gotten a lot of mileage out of contextualizing the morality of its world so far beyond simple binary thinking, and because no solution tends to be optimal, you can really justify the actions every party makes. Or at least you can understand them. The relocation of the city's poor to the underground was led by a man named Jack Batty. He had been Father's lieutenant, but this decision by Father led to the partnership ending and Jack establishing a resistance organization hell-bent on putting an end to Father's dictatorship. The central conflict presented to us in the Armored Core series usually has a prevailing order which has lingered far past the point of it going insane, being challenged by an up-and-coming alternative order. And because these are action games, the winner will always be decided by mech warfare. When the resistance struck, Father had already prepared and teamed up with a private military company known only as the Company to crush the rebellion. In the fighting, Jack Batty was killed by the Chief, who is the main antagonist of the game. If you've been paying attention to the Armored Core series so far, you might ask yourself whether or not they intend to do a plot twist reveal at the end to show that Chief is actually an AI, and the numerous times Chief survives a parent's death will only come to reinforce that suspicion. The battle that felled Jack Batty is known in-universe as the First Rebellion. Armored Core 5 is much more in line with the action game conventions of its era than previous Armored Core games were. We have a core cast of characters and an abundance of mid-mission cutscenes. This feels the least like an Armored Core game out of the entire lineup of titles I've covered in this series so far, and it has to do with the game's development history, the Chromehound's origins, and Nabeshima's insistence on taking the series in a new creative direction. It's weird to think about, but the most online-intensive AC game we'd seen up until this point also had the most conventional, single-player campaign in the entire franchise. The game takes place a year after the First Rebellion. Actually, the first mission takes place during it, and introduces us to the world from the opposite perspective, because we're actually a city police officer at the start. We have Carol Dory as our operator, we're hunting down Jack Batty, and we're on the side of the Chief. I think this mission really gets across just how stylistically different Armored Core 5 is from its predecessors, because there's an emphasis on the characters we meet, and the mission is so much more broken up with cutscene encounters than what you'd expect from an Armored Core game. In the first mission, we meet with Jack Batty and watch as the Chief kills him, and even though it's not a big thing, I like that they solved for introducing us to the First Rebellion, but also having us be a Resistance rookie by just having us be on the other side of the fighting in the first mission. The rest of the story takes place after the fighting, where the Resistance is led by Frances Betty Curtis, who is Jack's adopted daughter. The player character has joined the Resistance in the interim period between the First Rebellion and the events of the game, and is known in-game as the Mercenary. The events of the game to follow will detail the Second Rebellion. I noted this earlier, but the drastic overhauls this game made to the series came about because Nabeshima felt that any alteration to the formula in previous games could only be incremental, minor stuff. Because the developers focused a lot more on online play, and because Nabeshima brought in a bunch of ideas he had from Chromehounds to this game, he deliberately didn't want to do what he'd done before. He wanted the game to have more tactical considerations, and he wanted the game to play good online. The 4th gen games showed what the license could do when the speed limiter was removed. Those games were built from the ground up with analog stick control in mind, and that change trickled down into how neatly the player could maneuver the mechs, which changed how much more precision the game could ask of the player, which changed the best practices for enemy design, which changed the combat, which changed the optimal level design, etc. The 5th gen games keep the liberated control scheme, and for integrating the online, the developers seemed to have gone back down into the minds of the old conceptualization of the mech warfare, and picked up that if they focus on tactics and slow things down to de-emphasize the sippy responsiveness of the controls, and instead focus on empowering the player to make intelligent use out of the mechanics, they'd have something interesting. And a lot of the changes make sense when you figure that's what they're for. One of the key ideas driving the design for the online was that no player should be able to do everything amazingly, and that every mech should be bad at least one thing, so players would have to cooperate. This is why we have the 3-pronged attack system. We can deal kinetic, chemical, and thermal damage. Think bullets, explosions, and lasers. Players can specialize in dealing one type of damage and be really good at that, or they can try to be more fully rounded and not be great at anything. The point was that teamwork would be necessary to succeed. The speed is reduced from the 4th gen games to make firefights easier, and instead of moving the mech too fast to be hit, players are made dependent on using cover. To make buildings act as good cover, the mechs have been drastically shrunken in size. The The reason flying is so gimped is because it's a third-person cover shooter, and if the player wants to gain height, which is such an advantage in this title, they need to expose themselves for however long it takes for them to scale the building. I think it's interesting just how much the single-player experience feels like it was cobbled together with mechanics very much intended for online play, and I think it's a testament to good craft that the game turned out pretty good. This game's emphasis on teamwork feeds into the single-player experience as well. A great returning feature is the ability to hire other mercenaries to help out in missions. This time around though, the hires are exclusively other players, which is a feature which has noticeably aged poorly, what with the servers going offline. I should note that Verdict Day, the sequel to this title, solved for this by letting the player hire AI bots, like we could back in the old games. Our team in the story consists of Rosary, Leon Dantes, RD, and Fran. At least, these are the characters on our side, and outside of RD and Rosary, they're not the most developed characters of all time or anything, but they characterize the Resistance quite nicely as idealistic underdogs. And I like how they explore some of the game's themes. RD's real name is Ray Dominato. Come on, From. And he goes from being our timid operator to betraying us and joining up with the corporation. The game doesn't come out and ask this, often at least, but the characters are often connected to the idea of purpose. RD is a risk-averse and paranoid man with a deep fear of death, and this is why he switches sides. He doesn't think the Resistance will survive and figures that the odds are better with the corporation. Above all else, he seems to want to live, but he must understand that there's no life waiting for him at the end of the path he's chosen. His story actually comes to an end when he pilots Jack Batty's old mech in a fight against us and loses. Because the online is so deeply ingrained in the game's makeup, the best practices in mission design have changed, and you can really feel that in how many times, especially in the Order missions, we are just fighting other ACs. This was handled with the arenas in previous games, but now those fights have been folded back into the main story, and the happenings in the story missions and the Order missions have been bracketed by the identifying classifier they have and by how they happen in different time periods. The really meaty stuff is all in the main story, and it's what I'm spending most of this video on, partly because I didn't know that the Order missions had stories in them until after finishing the first recording of this video. Hooray for rewrites. But interestingly, even though the main story had so much more detail to it, and was clearly where the level designers and scripters were at their best, the best story of the game actually takes place, I think, over the Order missions, and I'll go over that in a bit when we discuss Rosary, the Men of Honor, and the Zodiac. Earlier, I went over how the limitations of technology informed the core concepts of this license during the development of the first game, and in the story of this game, we see the same thing happening. The combat is optimized for online play, and the characterization of the warfare in the single player has to abide by the same style, which means the Resistance doesn't fight with flair, but with guerrilla tactics. Their unorthodox and underhanded maneuvers have thrown the city police into chaos, and that chaos eventually creates the opportunity for the Resistance to try and capture Father in his stronghold. Outside of the side activities, the combat in Armored Core 5 is always contextualized within a specific mission parameter of the main story, so one mission always naturally leads into the next, with the activities in the last one often acting as the context for why we're doing what we're doing in the current mission. And what we're doing is fighting. This is an action game after all. From the offset, the series' combat has been the kind where, to employ tactics, you needed to actively search that stuff out. The glimpses we got of great missions with real tactical gameplay options in previous games were great, but most of the time the best approach was the standard approach of just shooting and killing the enemies while strafing to the side to avoid fire. Even though the pre-4th gen games had a specific button for interacting with the environments, the movement mechanics we had were never great for engaging with the world around us. It was very clunky. It worked to deliver on the kinds of experiences those games were aiming for, but it resulted in the combat not integrating environmental clutter very well. Here, however, it seems mandatory for every build to really flex their situational awareness muscles and strategize around the environment. This is possible because of what I said earlier about how the mechs are smaller here than in previous games. In the 4th gen titles, Nabeshima felt that the environment had sort of disappeared as a relevant factor in the gameplay because of how liberated the flying was. So, to differentiate this game from the 4th gen ones, they wanted the player to interact more with the environments. Use houses for cover and be able to go underground and into metro tubes and such. And this emphasis on empowering the player to make tactical use out of the environments and enemy AI and such brings the customization game roaring back to life after they softballed the showing in the 4th generation. The 4th generation games were great, but the customization felt like a step down after what we'd seen before. Partly I figure it's because the liberating flying mechanics made so many builds obsolete and streamlined the best build paths down to a very specific way of playing those games. Armored Core 5's heavier feeling combat, in contrast, feels a lot more open to player expression and experimentation. When I play these games, I like to run a snappy mech. I like to move forwards and turn fast, and because I do, in this game I like to have as wide a targeting field as I possibly can, because I want to be able to take aim at the enemy without even needing to aim myself at them, so that when we are maneuvering at high speeds around each other, I can usually get a clear shot of the enemy whenever they enter my general field of view, but they can't do the same to me because they're not optimized like I am. The problem I have is that the wider the targeting field gets, the shorter its range tends to be, and to compensate for this, when I'm fighting ACs, I drop a lot of stationary enemy scout objects around so that I always have a good sense for where the opponent is, and I can make my way towards them using the buildings as cover. Sniper fire is not really my jam, outside of the Giga Cannon ultimate weapon, so emphasizing these strengths in my mechs is how I get over the hurdles. But this doesn't feel like it's the most obviously best way to play Armored Core 5, like how the build I had going for myself in the 4th gen games really felt like that was the correct way of playing those games. Here it feels a lot more like my mech is an expression of the tactical approach I personally like to take, than my tactical approach being tailored around the best practices for clearing out enemies. Since the player is so much smaller and cover is so much more useful, they decided to cut the radar and added the scan mode, a non-combat mode which uses much less energy and allows the player to get a lot of stats about their heading and about the enemies' weak points and strengths. The developers also decided to kill the flying and replace it with a hover because the flight undermined the terrain. If you ever felt that the 5th gen games were heavier, this is probably why. I like this presentation a lot, but I'd be lying if I said I felt it was as carefully considered on all fronts as I feel the 4th gen recalibration of the core mechanics there was. As much as those games maybe undermined the customization, I never got the feeling that the developers had made a blatant error when configuring things around the changed focus on speed, and the worst of what I feel to be the missing considerations here is probably the map boundary, because I'm noticeably dying more from exiting area boundaries than I ever did before. In the old games, we had the radar to tell us when we went too close to the map boundary, but now, if you're backing away from a fight while engaging the enemy, you might just back out of the map entirely and end your run then and there. I can't believe I'm about to say this, but I actually think it would have been better if the map boundary had an invisible wall. I don't love those, so maybe instead if the mech camera display just malfunctioned so the game would be unplayable unless we face the area again, or something like that would be better. This is by no means game-breaking, but I do consider this to be an oversight which might go to show how important it is to question the function of every element of a game before dedicating yourself to making changes. That being said, I'm only evaluating the single-player experience here. I never played the multiplayer, but I can see how the loosely communicated map boundary might facilitate some different tactical approaches when you're fighting other players. For example, positioning yourself very close to the boundary to make it act as an insta-kill wall, which narrows the movement range of your opponent if you can overwhelm them with firepower after positioning the two of you carefully close to it. That might have been a function in the online, but for the single player, I think rethinking it was warranted. On the flip side, I really like the integration of the ultimate weapons into the story because they really got around to making these weapons feel formidable, even in spite of how bad they surely were in the multiplayer. Again, I didn't play the multiplayer, and if you did, please confirm or debunk this suspicion of mine, but I cannot imagine the ultimate weapons ever saw much use, and if they didn't, it's a shame, because when we've finally unlocked them, they turn out to be really fun. The reason I can't imagine these things had much use in the multiplayer is because of how competitive scenes tend to hone in on reliable power above anything else. And the ultimate weapons, while insanely powerful, just take too long to charge for me to believe they were of much use. If you want to challenge yourself, these things are undoubtedly the most expensive and dedicated way of playing a mission. Sure, they kill anything they touch the moment they make impact, but firstly, they take up the sidearms, so you're immediately denying yourself of options if the fight drags out or if the enemy happens to have a strong defense against the damage types of the main arms you brought into the fight. Secondly, on the ultimate weapons slander, when you swap over to them, they begin to hobble you immediately. You move weirdly, if at all, and the screen begins crackling and you're under a time restraint to use the weapons before the limit is reached. The mech can't contain the power any longer and they just automatically fire. Thirdly, there's only one opportunity to use these per mission, so if you release the trigger and whiff, you've committed and exposed yourself to whatever damage came your way for nothing. You can see why I'd be skeptical of them having much use in the multiplayer, right? But, like I said, for the story, they are really well integrated. In lore, they are designed without regard to the mechs and the stress using them places on the machines and the pilots, so you might be suspicious of the humanity of those who try to wield these weapons. And my god, it turns out Chief wields two of them. Two ultimate weapons for the game's ultimate antagonist. But the first we actually see of an ultimate weapon is in the beginning with Jack Batty. He's planning to take us out with it, but Chief kills him before he can. In Mission 5, we fight Chief armed with a Giga Cannon, and this is a really bad weapon. It's a long charge-up sniper which insta-kills whatever it hits. So to make it a real threat, they designed the level around us needing to make our way across an ocean to reach Chief while Chief is actively shooting at us. And he doesn't have the one shot per mission limiter. We kill him at the end of this mission, but he comes back somehow in Mission 7 and we fight him where we saw him kill Jack Batty in the beginning of the game. This time around we're on opposite sides though. This mission takes place after the Resistance has caused a lot of chaos which has completely overwhelmed the city police. The Resistance moved to capture Father in his stronghold, but when they struck, the corporation air-bombed the building and killed everyone inside of it, including Father. It's in fighting our way through the wreckage that we come face to face with Chief. And after we defeat him, he resurrects, somehow, and rips out a pillar to create a makeshift mass blade. That ultimate weapon is a big old sword with a long wind-up which insta-kills whatever it touches. I've used it in some of the order missions to take out enemy ACs quickly, but like the other ultimate weapons, this one has so many drawbacks that I don't think it had a lot of utility in the multiplayer. Again, correct me in the comments if you tore up the online meta with this thing. Crappy or not, the developers needed this weapon to be formidable in the single player, so they set the fight in a very cramped space so that the second phase against Chief is all about creating and maintaining distance from him, since one hit can literally end us. I will say that I consider this part of the game to be one of the worst sections I've played in any Armored Core because of how drawn out the fight is and how easy it is to lose a lot of progress really quickly, but for the characterization of the ultimate weapons, yeah, I saw that thing in the hands of Chief as a big threat, and actually, these ultimate weapons do kinda help support the idea that no mech can be best at everything. Even in the later order missions, when I found myself soloing against two ACs with complementary strategies, like one would maybe be a sniper and the other was a close quarters fighter who defended the sniper, oftentimes I could make the setup stop mattering because getting a kill with an ultimate weapon from across the map was enough to completely crumble the encounter and let me sniper the close-up guy or rip the sniper to shreds. And for the zippy Sumi close-up fights, it was often just a question of starting the fight by charging up an attack and releasing it the moment the enemy came into range. Those approaches weren't 100% successful, and I very much doubt that this would have worked in the multiplayer where the enemies are actually capable of learning about these sorts of underhanded opening tactics. So for the online, I suspect the ultimate weapons were dead on arrival, but for the single player stuff, I found myself really liking them. While the resistance pulls back, the corporation begins to destroy everything they can to push and overwhelm the resistance. After the order to abandon the assault, they decide to try and help as many civilians as they can, and during the evacuation period, the player is made to defend the resistance's rearguard before the final retreat, which leaves them all scattered, wandering the wastelands. I've talked a lot about the mech economy in these videos, and I think the conclusion to the story here is quite interesting. You can say that Father's rule was evil, that he imposed injustices on the world, but there really isn't a solution provided by the game as to how he could have done things differently. And the Resistance seems to be a bit more concerned with getting rid of Father than they are with what comes next. The Order which inherits the world is fractured, and we'll talk more about those entities in the Verdict Day video, but for now, we once again see that the interests of the mech economy are being fed regardless of the consequences this has on humanity. And we're at the heart of it. Complicit again because we keep grinding out missions for paychecks, to get new mech parts, to be better at the missions, without any thought to the consequences of our actions. For myself, I can say that most of the time when I've played these games, but not always, my consideration for the story was secondary to the urge to get lost in the mech customization. I talked earlier about the gameplay in the 5th gen games feeling heavier, and this can also be attributed to the animations and the customization. The animations are exaggerated because Nabeshima wanted to clearly communicate to the player the difference between good and bad play. So if an opponent is strong against kinetic attacks, the bullets will actually ping off of them to showcase how the approach isn't great. We have the scan mode if you want to overthink things and really get into the nitty-gritty of optimization, but since the animations are so much bigger than before, the battlefield reads even from a great distance. Side note, this feeds really nicely into the build variety because the optimal combat range is markedly different for different builds this time around, and they actually rethought the legs to reflect this. Bipedal legs are designed for short-range, frontline fighters. Tank treads are for ambushes, and quadrupeds are intended for snipers. These aren't hard and fast rules or anything, but if you want to really optimize things to the max, you'll probably want to abide by the intended functions of the mech parts. Customization is very core to the series. Nabeshima has described Armored Core as fundamentally being a game where the player fights with mecha made by themselves. Naotoshi Jin, the founder of FromSoftware, has talked about how the original idea for Armored Core was never that special, but once limb customization came about, it was suddenly a genius idea because it was every boy's dream to make their own mechs. And for all of the changes made to the formula from gameplay to the presentation of the story, this sentiment has not been strayed away from since the series' inception, and since the first game, the foundational pillars of this series have been preserved. Remixed? Sure. Reinterpreted? Sure. But never abandoned. I think the gameplay which characterizes Armored Core is very flexible and open to reinterpretation because the how of telling the story isn't as important as whether or not the presentation manages to tell this story. The story of mankind versus machines, and how, however power is distributed in this license, humanity seems destined to destroy itself. We don't get happy endings in these games because the conflict doesn't break out until it's too late to solve the underlying problems of the world without massive carnage. And at best, we're usually left holding on to hope that, in the future, things may be better. The story of Armored Core 5 ends with the player wandering the polluted wastelands, only to have a final confrontation against the Chief, who now pilots the Exousia. Chief's operator is Carol Dory, our operator from the beginning of the game, and I think this end boss really showcases how Armored Core 5's story is constantly evolving. From the offset, I couldn't really pin down the precise function of every character, and throughout the game I was surprised to find out that characters I expected to make a big impact, like Father, were not even seen, but early game minor characters often get a lot of attention. Carol and Chief are an interesting dynamic, and they have very different personalities. Carol is cold and stoic, but Chief is chaotic and flamboyant. He often flat out ignores her advice, but it doesn't really seem to bother her. Like I said, the final fight against Chief has him piloting the Exousia mech. Exousia is Greek for power, but what's more interesting, I think, is how a lot of the machines in the game are bird-themed. A quick Google search told me that the Raven moniker might symbolize Yatagarasu, if instead of being a raven it's actually a crow. I know there's a difference, but the vibes still connect if we follow this line of thinking. Yatagarasu is a Shinto god, and a representation of heavenly or divine powers intervening in the affairs of mankind, which makes a certain amount of dark, cynical sense for the mercenaries in this license, since we also act for the powers above mankind. Here, that power is twofold: Father and the corporation. If we consider the amount of AI entities associated with the corporation, we might logically assume that it's being run by one, which is actually shown in site material to Verdict Day, which talks about how the AIs were created by an older civilization to oversee the rejuvenation of humanity after the Great Pollution, a story we've seen in this license before. If the raven imagery is meant to evoke Yatagarasu, then we have a conflict where human beings and the agents of the AI are both dressing up as the representations of divine intervention. But only one side can win and claim having the powers of heaven behind it. The fight against the Exousia is actually quite easy, and we get an interesting moment from Carol after. Hers and Chief's biggest difference might be how Chief harbors a deep hatred of mankind, but after we defeat him, Carol shows her true colors and says that extraordinary individuals, like the player mercenary, prove that humanity may yet be worthy of survival. The corporation is far from defeated. Humanity has scored a big point, and the player character, who will be known in the lore of this universe as the Dark Raven, will become a beacon for mankind to rally around. Once again, an Armored Core game ends with hope being the best that can be given to humanity. It's interesting that before the corporation became the main antagonist, we were fighting in a revolution against a human dictator, almost like the developers did not want to wash humanity's hands and wanted to make a case for just how innate conflict is to mankind in this license, even without the AIs. And I think that even though Father never physically shows up, he still managed to connect a lot of the separate ideas this license has ruminated on over the course of 13 games, before this one, managed to connect a lot of these ideas together into a really strong character. The contrast of first fighting a human tyranny and then fighting a robot tyranny is not lost on me, but Father is a character very much wrapped in dualities, the class warfare and his relationship with Jack Batty. Father's real name is actually Don Tyrell, and he and Jack are named for Blade Runner, where these characters are the creator of the androids and the dying android, respectively. The emblem which symbolizes Father reads Odi et Amo. It's a Latin phrase which comes from an old Roman poem, and it means I hate and I love. The poem continues, "Why I do this, perhaps you ask, I know not, but I feel it happening and I am tortured." This is the nature of mankind in Armored Core, and after the conflict in this game's main story, these people have a world to save. 2 years after the events of Armored Core 5, the game's order missions take place. These seem, to me, to have been a way to perhaps preserve some of the online, or maybe it was the team's way of integrating arena fights into the game without having an actual arena. Most missions here just have us be plopped down in some map to take out another AC or to clear out enemies. The scenario direction is much more hands-off than what we saw in the main game, and actually, these feel a lot more like conventional Armored Core missions. They get pretty repetitive, so you'll likely enjoy these as much as you find yourself able to squeeze enjoyment out of the core gameplay. There's more than 80 of them in total, so that might sound like a tall order, but I completed all of them and had a blast. And actually, I think the story here, even though it's so much more understated than the already understated story in the main missions, I think the story here is actually better themed. Specifically around the idea of purpose and survival. Why do the people in this license go on? And what would it take to save them? The Order missions bring us into conflict with the forces outside of the city. The alternate reality of the migrants who scavenge the wastelands searching for technology to use and to sell to stay alive. This reality juxtaposes against the city, and when you understand the state of the world, you wonder how sheltered the Resistance was to have the luxury of complaining about Father's tyranny. Outside of the city gates, things are so much worse, both in terms of the physical conditions mankind lives under, but also under the spiritual. In the city, they had materials to sustain themselves, and they had a dictator to topple, something to strive towards. But in the wastelands, for the longest time, there is nothing. The migrants just travel from one place to another in search of something, and they don't even know what that is. The first real enemy we face in the Order missions are the Men of Honor. Their ranks are filled with migrants, and through their military might, they control a lot of neutral territory. This organization was formed long before the events of the game by a woman named Elizabeth, and the story of the organization is just a loose retelling of Shakespeare's King Lear. Elizabeth, like King Lear, has 3 daughters named Goneril, Regan, and Cordelia, and like King Lear, the story is about the danger of divided power. The sisters began fighting amongst each other over control of the Men of Honor when Elizabeth got old and ill, and this led to the organization suffering. Eventually, Elizabeth passes away, and Regan took control of the organization. Goneril stayed by her side, begrudgingly, and Cordelia bailed on the whole thing. With the political infighting ended, the Men of Honor began prospering once more, but our fighting with the warlords of the wastelands puts us into conflict with them. The player mercenary, along with Fran and Rosary, become targeted by the Men of Honor because Rosary is actually Cordelia, and the sibling rivalry has not died down. The story escalates until Rosary and Regan meet up again, and Regan orders for Rosary to be executed, only for the player to step in and put a stop to that. This begins a trend of Regan swearing to come back and finish the job, which ultimately ends with her losing control over the organization as her capabilities as a leader come into question, and she exhausts the group's loyalties until she's left with no one by her side but her bodyguard / butler Oswald. Oswald was also a character in King Lear, by the way. We fight against Oswald twice, and in these fights, the game reflects on the idea of loyalty, and again, purpose. In the second fight, Regan is adamant that cowardice from Oswald will not be tolerated, and he follows his mission to his death at the hands of the player. Rosary actually starts questioning Oswald's misplaced loyalties, and like the main story did, the Order story takes a pivot from the brutal interactions of mankind amongst themselves to the interactions between mankind and machines, and the blurred line which separates the two. All the way back in Armored Core 1, the world was controlled by an artificial intelligence, and the insane and soul-crushing morality of the world made sense because everything was being managed by a soulless computer. The thing is though, every human in the system was following the orders that came from above them, and this made for an interesting juxtaposition of mankind and machines. If human beings accept missions where they are made to destroy one another for no reason other than it being the task set before them, what makes people different from machines who are programmed to follow orders without questioning them? After Oswald's demise, Regan tries to flee the battle scene but is killed by a member of Zodiac. Zodiac is not so much an organization as it is a project, like Human Plus. And I mean exactly like Human Plus, because the Zodiac pilots have all been cybernetically enhanced to create the most powerful AC pilots in the world. The transformation makes them into the Designed, and it strips them of their humanity. Whatever the purpose for their creation was long ago, it has been forgotten, and now the Zodiac exists only to continue fighting. Their operator is Angie, and long ago, her mind was uploaded into a network so that she could support every member of Zodiac. After Regan's death, Zodiac becomes the main antagonist, and as we fight them and see more of their relationships with Angie and the missions she lays out for them, the more apparent their lack of purpose becomes. We learn that the Zodiac pilots have all had their minds tampered with so that they only know how to fight, and we learn that the Angie that commands them is not actually the Angie from way back when the project was still young. Over the years, she's changed. This idea of the roles given to people in this license overtaking their humanities is something that is often gone back to, and Angie's and the Designed's lack of humanity is seen in how carelessly Angie keeps throwing them at us and in how flippantly the Designed regard their lives. Even when they mock her for failing to take out the player mercenary, they don't hesitate when she has given them an order to march to their death at our hands. There's a pretty dark statement made by one of the Zodiac after we fight them that the sacrifices they've made for the project have not paid off, and that they've become nothing more than puppets for a reason they can no longer remember. After all of the fighting with the Zodiac, you might expect some sort of big revelation, or you might want for the themes of the game to be neatly resolved, but we don't really get that. The Zodiac all die, and Angie decides to shut herself down. The main story and the order missions play very differently, but the question posed to us at the start of the game is still left open at the end. What are we fighting for, and why can't mankind escape from the endless cycle of war? Humanity is lacking purpose. The Zodiac fights ruminate on how the Designed's loyalty to the missions and the fighting they did was useless because it was ultimately for nothing. They didn't know what they fought, they just did because that was the mission, and they'd done it for so long that they didn't even remember what the original point was, if there ever was one. The story of Armored Core 5 is expanded upon in some supplementary material. With Regan gone, the Men of Honor eventually elect Goneril to command, and she also goes after Rosary, but not to kill her. Goneril has heard of a tower, and she seeks Rosary out to help her find it deep in the contaminated zone. After the events near the tower, Rosary makes a return to the Men of Honor and takes up the name Cordelia once more. But she didn't come to be a junior partner. She actually ousts Goneril from command and takes the organization over herself. She even gets rid of the council and tightens her grip on the organization. King Lear's theme of the danger of divided power might be creeping in here, or the story might be deliberately contrasting Cordelia to Father John Tyrell. The Zodiac don't remember why they fought, do we? The resistance in the main story has us topple a dictator, and the conclusion to the happenings in the Order missions see us establish another one. Why did we fight? And why can't mankind be saved? The Men of Honor will come to prosper under Cordelia's rule, and their lineal descendants, the Sirius Corporation, will make an appearance in Armored Core Verdict Day. And while Armored Core 5 does not have many answers to the questions it raises, Verdict Day does. Stay tuned for that retrospective. If you want to catch that video, be sure to subscribe so that you won't miss it when it goes live, and if you want to have an early look, be sure to check out the channel Patreon over at patreon.com/medievalmegaman. The link can be found in the video description. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, and be sure to leave a comment with some of your own thoughts. I'm AesirAesthetics. See you in the next one.